My name is Claire, and I'm somewhere in my mid-30s now. For most of my adult life, I've worked in environments where people like me are often described the same way: steady, reliable, low maintenance. I've been the person who delivers without demanding attention, who listens more than she speaks, who stays calm when others get loud. Depending on who you ask, that makes me easy to work with or easy to overlook. If you had met me back then, you probably wouldn't have guessed there was much of a story here. I didn't fit the image of someone heading toward a dramatic turning point. I wasn't rebellious. I wasn't confrontational. I didn't walk around waiting for revenge or validation. I believed, perhaps too deeply, that good work eventually speaks for itself, and that respect, once earned, tends to stay. What I want to tell you is not a revenge story. There's no shouting, no public takedown, no cinematic justice. There's no villain monologue or sudden triumph. This is a story about erosion, how respect can be worn down slowly, almost politely, until one day you realize something essential has been lost. And as I've learned, respect lost is hard to earn back. I'm sharing this now because many of us have lived some version of it. We stay professional, we stay calm, we explain things away. We tell ourselves it's not worth reacting, that we're being mature, that silence is strength. Sometimes it is. And sometimes silence becomes a role others assign you, one you never agreed to play. Over the next while, I'll walk you through how I was seen, how small moments accumulated, and how a single meeting only revealed what had already been broken. You'll hear about restraint, preparation, and a decision that didn't come from anger, but from clarity. I won't dramatize it. I won't exaggerate anyone's cruelty, including my own blind spots. I'll just tell you exactly how it felt to realize that staying had begun to cost more than leaving. If you've ever wondered whether you're being patient or simply being diminished, have you ever asked yourself when silence stops protecting you? In the beginning, I was useful in the quietest way possible. Not impressive, not intimidating, just dependable. At work, people described me with words that sounded positive, but carried very little weight. Claire's solid. She's easy. She'll handle it. No one ever said essential. No one said irreplaceable. I wasn't the voice that filled meeting rooms or the personality that lingered after conversations ended. I was the person whose work showed up on time, formatted correctly, with the problems already solved before anyone realized they existed. I didn't mind that at first. I took a certain pride in being invisible and effective. I told myself that competence didn't need an audience, that real value didn't announce itself, and in a way, I believed that being underestimated gave me freedom. No one hovered, no one micromanaged. I was trusted to just get it done. What I didn't realize was how quickly trust can slide into assumption. Meetings were the clearest example. I was always there, usually seated along the side or near the end of the table. I spoke when asked. I took notes even when it wasn't my responsibility. When conversations drifted into vague territory, I quietly brought them back to numbers, timelines, and constraints. People nodded, moved on, and rarely circled back to acknowledge where the clarity came from. Sometimes my ideas would reappear minutes later, reframed in someone else's voice. I noticed, but I didn't correct it. It felt petty to interrupt the flow just to say, "That was mine." I told myself it didn't matter who said it, as long as the work moved forward. That was the pattern. I absorbed small moments and filed them away without comment. My boss, Mark, fit easily into this ecosystem. He was articulate, confident, and visibly comfortable with authority. In meetings, people leaned toward him, waited for his reactions, and mirrored his tone. He wasn't overtly cruel or explosive. That's important to say. He didn't yell. He didn't insult me directly. If you had asked him, he probably would have said he respected me. But respect, I learned, is not what people claim. It's what they protect. To Mark, I was a stabilizer. Someone who smoothed things over. Someone who filled gaps without asking why they existed. When deadlines tightened or clients became difficult, my name surfaced not with praise, but with expectation. Claire will handle it. Claire can fix that. Let's have Claire take care of the details. Details, that word followed me everywhere. In performance reviews, I was consistently described as reliable, professional, and low drama. Those traits were framed as strengths, but they never translated into advancement or influence. I watched louder, less prepared colleagues take up space I never thought to claim. They were rewarded for visibility. I was rewarded with more work. Still, I stayed. Part of it was practicality. I had built a life around stability. Another part was belief. I believed that if I kept showing up with integrity, someone would eventually notice the full picture. That one day, my consistency would be seen not as background noise, but as structure. And part of it, if I'm being honest, was that I had become accustomed to the role. Being the calm one, the reasonable one, the one who didn't take things personally. When you're quiet for long enough, people stop checking whether your silence is consent or simply restraint. Looking back, I can see how clearly defined my place was. I wasn't there to challenge, I wasn't there to lead. I was there to support the story others were telling about themselves. The competent boss, the decisive team, the smooth operation. I was the margin. Not mistreated, not celebrated, just there. And at the time, I thought that was enough. I didn't yet understand that invisibility, once accepted, becomes a language others use to speak over you. The first time it happened, it was so minor that I almost dismissed it before it fully registered. It was during a routine Monday meeting, the kind that followed a predictable rhythm. Status updates, timelines, a few polite disagreements softened by professional language. I had prepared a short summary in advance, highlighting a risk that hadn't yet surfaced in the data, but was clear if you knew where to look. I'd seen it before, small delays stacking quietly until they became expensive. When it was my turn to speak, I kept it brief. I always did. I explained the issue, suggested a preventative adjustment, and referenced the numbers that supported it. Mark nodded, eyes already drifting to the next agenda item. No comment, no question. The conversation moved on. That wasn't unusual. What was unusual came 10 minutes later. As the discussion circled back to planning, Mark paused and said almost casually, "We should probably adjust the timeline here. There's a risk of compounding delays if we don't act early." He used almost my exact phrasing. No one looked at me. No one connected the dots. Heads nodded. Pens moved. Someone said, "Good catch." And Mark accepted the credit without hesitation, as if the idea had simply formed in the room. I remember sitting there, hands folded, feeling a small, sharp awareness bloom in my chest. Not anger, more like surprise. The moment had passed too quickly to interrupt without seeming awkward. And I told myself, again, that it wasn't worth it. After the meeting, a colleague stopped by my desk and said, "That was smart thinking about the timeline." I smiled and said, "Yeah," letting the ambiguity stand. That was the first cut. It didn't hurt much. It didn't bleed, but it marked something. From then on, I started noticing patterns I had previously blurred over. How Mark would ask for my input privately, then present conclusions publicly as his own. How my emails would be forwarded upward without attribution. How my role in outcomes was understood only in the absence. Noticed when something went wrong, invisible when it went right. Still, I didn't speak up. Part of me feared being seen as difficult. Another part feared being seen as emotional, or worse, insecure. I had built my professional identity around composure, and I wasn't willing to fracture it over something that could be dismissed as trivial. So I rationalized. I told myself this was just how leadership worked. Those ideas flowed upward. That recognition wasn't the point, that I was being too sensitive. Everyone borrows language, everyone collaborates. This is a team, but teams, I learned, have memory. And mine was beginning to feel selective. There was another moment, weeks later, a meeting with senior stakeholders. I had spent days preparing the analysis, late nights, careful cross-checks, anticipating questions before they were asked. Mark presented the deck. I sat near the back. When a complex question came up, he hesitated. Just briefly. I leaned forward, ready to clarify if needed. He answered with something vague, then said lightly, "We'll have Claire dig into that and follow up." Dig into it, as if I hadn't already. The room accepted this without question, and in that acceptance, something shifted. Not outwardly, internally. I began to understand that the issue wasn't one moment of oversight, it was an accumulation, a series of small dismissals that, taken alone, could be excused, but together formed a pattern of erasure. I didn't confront him. I didn't correct the record. I stayed consistent, professional, quiet. But I remembered. That's the thing about small cuts. They don't demand immediate attention. They just change how you hold yourself afterward. A little more guarded, a little more alert, a little less generous with the benefit of the doubt. Everyone else moved on. I didn't. Disrespect rarely announces itself. It settles in slowly, like background noise you stop noticing because it never quite rises to the level of disruption. After that first small cut, nothing overtly changed. My workload stayed heavy. My performance reviews stayed positive. Mark continued to describe me as dependable, detail-oriented, and a strong support. If anything, my responsibilities increased. I was trusted with more complex work, more sensitive information, more pressure, just not more authority. And because nothing dramatic happened, I adjusted. That adjustment is something I think many people will recognize. You don't wake up one morning and decide to accept less. You simply respond to what's in front of you. You smooth things over. You let one comment slide. You assume the best intentions. Over time, your standards for how you're treated quietly recalibrate. I told myself I was being professional. When Mark interrupted me in meetings, I paused and waited for him to finish instead of reclaiming the floor. When my contributions were summarized by someone else, I nodded along instead of clarifying. When decisions were made without my input, despite my being responsible for the consequences, I adapted and made them work. Each time, I found a reasonable explanation. He's under pressure. This isn't personal. Leadership is messy. I don't need credit to feel secure. The problem wasn't any single justification. The problem was how many I was willing to stack. There was one meeting that stands out now, though at the time I treated it like all the others. I had flagged a compliance issue in advance, quietly, in writing. It wasn't urgent yet, but it would be. During the meeting, Mark dismissed it with a wave of his hand. "Let's not overcomplicate things," he said, smiling. "We'll cross that bridge later." A few people chuckled. The mood stayed light. I stayed silent. Weeks later, when the issue became unavoidable, the tone changed. Stress, scrambling, emergency calls. Mark stood in front of the team and said, "We should have seen this coming." I had, but what I felt in that moment wasn't vindication. It was a hollow kind of resignation. Because being right after being dismissed doesn't feel like winning. It feels like confirmation that your voice carries less weight than your results, and only when those results are missing. I began to notice how often I was framed as the solution, never the source. I fixed problems, I absorbed tension, I made other people look composed. And in doing so, I made it easier for them to believe that this was simply who I was. Reliable, quiet, uncomplaining. I also noticed how my silence was interpreted, not as restraint or patience, but as agreement, as availability, as permission. When Mark spoke over me, no one objected. When he joked lightly at my expense about my perfectionism or my overthinking, people smiled, assuming it was safe to laugh. I smiled too, because challenging it would have shifted the room. And I had become someone who maintained rooms, not disrupted them. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes with being seen as capable, but not considered. You're included in the work, but excluded from the conversation about the work. You're present, but peripheral. I normalized it by telling myself this was temporary, that if I just stayed consistent, something would shift. That respect would catch up with contribution, that this wasn't the hill to stand on. But normalization is powerful. It trains you to ignore your own discomfort. It teaches you that dignity is flexible, that it's something you can adjust in small increments without losing yourself. Until one day you realize how much you've already given up. At the time, I couldn't have named it as disrespect. The word felt too strong, too dramatic. I would have said misalignment, or communication gaps, or organizational dynamics. Anything but what it was. Because admitting you're being disrespected means admitting you've been allowing it. And that's a harder truth to sit with than silence. So I stayed quiet, and they learned exactly how much I would tolerate. It wasn't one moment that made me realize I had been assigned a role. It was the slow clarity that came from repetition. Once you see a pattern, you can't unsee it. I began to notice how predictably I was positioned. When new projects were announced, I wasn't introduced as a lead, even when I was responsible for the foundation. I was introduced as support, backup, or the person who will help keep things on track. When problems arose, my involvement increased. When success was discussed, my presence faded. No one ever said, "This is who you are." They didn't have to. Roles don't require verbal agreement. They're reinforced through behavior. In meetings, I was the one asked to take notes, even when junior staff were present. When timelines slipped, I was expected to absorb the correction. When tensions rose, eyes turned to me, silently asking me to de-escalate. I became the stabilizing force that allowed everyone else to perform urgency without consequence. And I played it well. That's the uncomfortable part. I was good at the role. I anticipated needs before they were expressed. I solved problems quietly. I adjusted my tone to match the room. I made it easier for others to feel competent. Over time, that competence was assumed, not appreciated. Mark leaned into this dynamic without malice, or at least without awareness. He relied on me heavily, but he didn't see me. To him, I was a constant, like infrastructure, necessary but not discussed unless something went wrong. When leadership meetings happened, I wasn't invited. When decisions affecting my work were made, I was informed afterward. When I asked questions, they were framed as clarifications, not contributions. I remember once asking why a particular strategy had shifted without notice. Mark responded with a smile and said, "We didn't want to overburden you. You already have enough on your plate." It sounded considerate. It wasn't. What it really meant was, "You'll adapt." And I did. I told myself this was just how hierarchies functioned, that not everyone needed to be at the table. That influence came in different forms. I told myself I had chosen depth over visibility. But choice implies agency, and I was beginning to realize I hadn't chosen this at all. The role came with expectations that I would be calm, that I would be available, that I wouldn't challenge decisions publicly, that I wouldn't take things personally. And because I met those expectations so consistently, they hardened into assumptions. When people expect you to be invisible, your absence becomes the only thing they notice. I started to sense it in small interactions, a pause when I didn't immediately volunteer to help, a flicker of irritation when I asked for clarity instead of fixing things, sadly a subtle surprise when I declined an extra task without explanation. The role had boundaries, and I was brushing up against them. There's a strange grief in realizing that the version of you others rely on is a reduced one, not inaccurate, but incomplete. It's the part of you that serves them best. I wasn't seen as someone with ambition, even though I had it. I wasn't seen as someone who could lead, even though I already was, in all but name. I was seen as a reliable support, the kind that doesn't ask for recognition and therefore doesn't receive it. Once I understood this, I faced an uncomfortable question. If I keep playing this role perfectly, what reason will anyone ever have to change it? The answer was obvious: none. And that realization didn't make me angry. It made me quiet in a different way, more observant, less accommodating. I stopped filling every gap automatically. I started noticing what happened when I didn't smooth things over. The role didn't disappear, but for the first time, I saw it clearly. And seeing it was the beginning of something shifting, slowly, internally, and without announcement. The shift didn't happen during a confrontation. There was no argument, no raised voice, no dramatic line delivered at the perfect moment. It happened on a day that looked ordinary from the outside. It was late afternoon, and the office had that muted, end-of-day stillness. Keyboards slowing, conversations lowering, people mentally stepping out of their roles before their bodies followed. I was reviewing a report that had already been revised twice, catching details no one else had time to look for anymore. Mark stopped by my desk. He leaned casually against the partition, scrolling through his phone as he spoke. "We need to move faster on this project," he said, not looking up. "Leadership's getting impatient." I nodded. I flagged that risk weeks ago. The timeline was always going to compress unless we adjusted earlier. He glanced up then briefly. "Right. Well, here we are. Can you just make it work?" Just, that word landed differently than it used to. I looked at him, really looked at him, and noticed something I had missed before. Not cruelty, not arrogance, but certainty. The certainty that I would absorb the pressure. The certainty that my role was to adjust, not to question. The certainty that my calm meant capacity. In that moment, something in me stepped back. I realized I wasn't tired. I wasn't overwhelmed. I wasn't even angry. I was done explaining, not done with the work. Done with the assumption that my responsibility included cushioning decisions I didn't make. I said evenly, "I can outline the constraints and options, but I can't make the timeline do something it's not designed to do." He frowned slightly, not in anger, more in surprise. "We don't need options, we need solutions." I nodded again. "Then the solution is changing expectations." There was a pause. It wasn't hostile, it wasn't dramatic, but it was unfamiliar. For the first time, I hadn't stepped in to resolve the discomfort. I hadn't softened the truth. I hadn't offered to stay late or find a workaround. Mark straightened. "Let's talk about this later," he said, and walked away. I sat there for a long moment after he left, hands resting on the desk, aware of my own breathing. Nothing external had changed. The project was still demanding, My position was still the same, but internally, a line had been crossed. That was the day I understood something clearly. Silence had been interpreted as agreement. Competence had been interpreted as consent, and I had been participating in that misunderstanding. The shift wasn't about rebellion, it was about alignment. I realized that continuing as I was meant continuing to reinforce a version of myself that no longer fit, one that prioritized harmony over honesty and usefulness over dignity. I didn't announce anything. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't make plans that day. I just stopped automatically stepping forward. When emails came in late, I responded during work hours. When tasks were vaguely assigned, I asked for clarity instead of filling in the blanks. When decisions were made without my input, I documented the impact instead of fixing it silently. Nothing broke. But things became visible. Small inefficiencies surfaced. Delays that had been absorbed now required discussion. Questions that used to land on my desk started circulating longer before being resolved. And I watched, not with satisfaction, with curiosity. The day something shifted wasn't about them noticing me. It was about me noticing myself, noticing the cost of being endlessly adaptable, noticing how much of my energy went into preserving an image of ease for others. I began to understand that boundaries don't always arrive as ultimatums. Sometimes they arrive as a quiet refusal to continue carrying what was never yours. That afternoon, I closed my notebook, shut down my computer, and left on time. It wasn't a statement. No one commented. The world didn't react. But I walked out knowing that whatever came next would be a choice, not an obligation. And once you feel that difference, it's impossible to unfeel it. After that day, my silence changed its texture. Before, it had been reflexive, an instinct to maintain balance, to keep things moving, to avoid friction. Now, it has become deliberate, measured, intentional. I still didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't correct people publicly. But I stopped cushioning the truth. I let my words land where they landed without rushing in to soften the impact. In meetings, when questions were asked that pointed directly at flawed assumptions, I answered them plainly. When decisions were made that carried obvious risks, I stated those risks once, clearly, and then let the room hold the responsibility. What surprised me most was how quickly my silence was reinterpreted. Where it had once been seen as calm professionalism, it now began to feel to others like resistance, not because I was doing less, but because I was no longer compensating for what wasn't addressed. Mark noticed first. He began checking in more frequently, asking if everything was okay. His tone was light, but there was an undercurrent of unease. The system we had both grown accustomed to was no longer functioning as smoothly, and he couldn't immediately see why. From his perspective, nothing had changed. I was still meeting deadlines, still delivering quality work, still composed. But I had stopped anticipating, and that, it turned out, had been the invisible engine all along. In one meeting, a proposal was being discussed that relied on assumptions I knew were incomplete. In the past, I would have stepped in, reframed the discussion, and offered a path forward. This time, I waited until someone asked directly. They didn't. The meeting ended with vague next steps and polite optimism. A week later, the gaps became problems. There was confusion, backtracking, frustration. No one accused me of anything. No one could. I had done exactly what was asked. But I could feel the shift in how people looked at me, as if trying to locate something they had taken for granted. Silence, I learned, is only seen as weakness when people believe you're withholding out of fear. When they sense it's a choice, it unsettles them. Mark's comments became sharper, not cruel, but pointed. "We need you to be more proactive," he said once. "You have good instincts." I replied calmly, "I'm being proactive within the scope of my role." The words were neutral, the implication wasn't. He didn't push further. What he couldn't articulate was that my role had always been flexible when it benefited him, and rigid when it came to recognition or authority. By defining its boundaries, I was exposing that imbalance. Others mistook my restraint for disengagement. I heard it in passing remarks. "She's been quiet lately. Maybe she's burned out. She used to jump in more." I didn't correct them, because the truth was, I was more engaged than ever. I was watching systems instead of smoothing them. I was observing how quickly expectations shifted when support was no longer invisible. I started documenting everything, not out of paranoia, but out of clarity. Decisions, timelines, who said what and when, not as ammunition, but as a record. For the first time, I wasn't relying on memory or goodwill. I was relying on facts. There's a particular power in choosing not to perform your usefulness, in letting others see the shape of their dependence without announcing it. I wasn't trying to teach anyone a lesson. I was simply no longer willing to pay the cost of being endlessly adaptable. Silence, when chosen, becomes a mirror. It reflects back what people expect from you and what they've been taking without acknowledgement. And as that reflection sharpened, I began to see something else forming beneath the surface. Preparation. Not rushed, not emotional, just steady. I didn't know yet what I would do with it, but I knew this. Whatever came next would be built on intention, not reaction. While the room focused on what felt different, no one paid attention to what remained the same. I was still doing my job, thoroughly, precisely, without drama. That consistency was comforting to them. It reassured them that whatever subtle tension had crept in was temporary, or personal, or imagined. People prefer explanations that don't require adjustment. What they never noticed was where my attention had shifted. I stopped thinking in terms of moments and started thinking in systems. Not just what I did, but how work moved through the organization, who depended on whom, where information is bottlenecked, which relationships carried unspoken weight. Because when you're quiet long enough, you hear everything. I knew which clients called me directly when something didn't feel right, even when Mark was officially their point of contact. I knew which processes only worked because I corrected them before they failed. I knew which reports leadership trusted without questioning because they had learned, over time, that if my name was attached, the numbers were solid. None of this was written down anywhere. That wasn't an accident. It was convenient. Systems grow around people who are reliable, not around documentation. And I had allowed that to happen because it made things efficient. Now I began to map it. I started documenting workflows that existed only in practice. I wrote down the reasoning behind decisions that had never been explained, only executed. I noted dependencies that were assumed, not acknowledged. I captured client preferences that lived in my head, not in the CRM. I did this quietly, methodically, without changing my demeanor. No one asked why. No one thought to. Mark still saw me as steady ground. The team still assumed I would catch what they missed. Leadership still believed operations were running smoothly because they always had. What they didn't notice was that I was no longer absorbing uncertainty. I was defining it. I also began to pay attention to conversations that didn't include me. Who spoke when I wasn't in the room? How decisions were framed upward? Where my work was being translated or diluted before it reached leadership? This wasn't about suspicion. It was about understanding reality as it was, not as I had hoped it to be. One afternoon, I was copied on an email thread by mistake. It was brief, and no one said anything inappropriate, but it was revealing. Mark summarized a project outcome as a team effort, highlighting challenges he had navigated and decisions he had steered. My role wasn't mentioned. That omission would have stung before. Now it is clarified, because I could see the pattern fully formed. My contributions were considered part of the background, like lighting or air conditioning. Essential, but not attributed. And here's what surprised me. Once I accepted that, I stopped wanting acknowledgement from the same source. Instead, I focused on control. Not control over people, but over my own exposure. Over what I gave and to whom. Over what remained undocumented and what didn't. I began to ensure that my communication left trails, clear, professional, unambiguous trails. I summarized meetings in writing. I confirmed decisions via email. I framed risks and constraints in language that couldn't be softened later, not defensively, precisely. At the same time, I invested quietly in myself. I updated credentials that had been sitting dormant. I reconnected with professional contacts I had kept warm over the years. Not with complaints, just conversations. I listened more than I spoke. I wasn't planning an exit yet. I was building optionality. There's a difference between preparing to leave and preparing to choose. One is reactive. The other is stabilizing. What they never noticed was that my loyalty had shifted. From the role I had been assigned to the principles I had been compromising. From keeping things smooth to keeping things true. I didn't broadcast this change. I didn't hint at dissatisfaction. I didn't withdraw effort. I simply stopped anchoring my identity to a place that no longer reflected me accurately. By the time subtle frustrations began surfacing around missed assumptions and unclear ownership, I already understood why. The system had relied on something it never named. And once named, even privately, it couldn't remain invisible. They didn't see preparation. They saw quiet. and they mistook it for the same silence they'd always known. The reveal didn't arrive as a rush of adrenaline or a moment of triumph. It came slowly, like clarity settling into place after a long period of noise. I was sitting alone at my kitchen table one evening, laptop open, notebook beside it, the same black leather one I'd carried for years. I wasn't working late. I wasn't stressed. I was reviewing what I had quietly assembled over months: documentation, workflows, correspondence, patterns. For the first time, I looked at it not as evidence of contribution, but as evidence of leverage. That word used to make me uncomfortable. It sounded aggressive, manipulative. But leverage isn't about power over others. It's about understanding where your presence matters more than anyone has admitted. And suddenly, I could see it clearly. I wasn't just completing tasks. I was holding continuity. I was the one who knew why things worked, not just how. I was the translator between departments, the interpreter of client expectations, the filter that kept leadership insulated from operational reality. If I stepped away, things wouldn't collapse immediately. They would drift. Small miscommunications would compound. Clients would feel less understood. Decisions would take longer. Confidence would erode. Not dramatically, but perceptibly. And crucially, none of this was malicious. It was structural. That realization was sobering, not empowering in the way movies depict empowerment. There was no sense of gotcha, just responsibility. I understood in that moment why I had felt so uncomfortable being invisible. It wasn't ego. There was misalignment between impact and acknowledgement, between responsibility and authority. I also understood something else. If I stayed, nothing would change. Mark wasn't a villain. He was operating within a system that rewarded confidence and output, not introspection. The organization valued smooth delivery, and I had been providing it too well to justify altering the structure. Change would require friction, and I wasn't willing to create friction from inside a role that had no real power to absorb it. So I asked myself a different question. Not how do I fix this, but what do I want to protect? The answer wasn't my position. It wasn't my reputation as easy. It wasn't the comfort of predictability. It was my integrity. I didn't want to become someone who quietly resented the people around her. I didn't want to measure my worth by how much I could endure without acknowledgement. I didn't want to look back and realize I had trained others to underestimate me by accepting it myself. That night, I didn't make any dramatic decisions. I didn't draft a resignation letter. I didn't rehearse conversations. I simply accepted a truth I had been avoiding. Staying would require me to keep shrinking in ways that felt increasingly dishonest. Once you accept that, your options clarify. Over the next few weeks, I tested my understanding, not by threatening departure, but by adjusting my availability further. I declined meetings that didn't require my presence. I redirected questions to the appropriate owners. Instead of answering them myself, I allowed gaps to be seen. The response was subtle but telling. Confusion increased. Mark grew more involved in operational details he hadn't touched in years. Leadership asked more questions. Clients requested clarity more often. No one said my name, but they felt the absence of what I had been providing. And I felt something else: calm. Not relief, not excitement, alignment. Because for the first time, I wasn't hoping for recognition. I wasn't waiting to be seen. I was making decisions based on what I knew to be true, not what I wished others would understand. The private reveal wasn't about discovering power. It was about reclaiming authorship over my own limits. And once you do that, there's no dramatic music, no swelling moment. Just a steady sense that whatever you choose next will be grounded in self-respect, not reaction. That's when I knew the decision ahead of me wouldn't be reversible. Not because of what it would change around me, but because of what it had already changed within me. The decision didn't come with urgency. There was no deadline circled in red, no final straw that snapped everything into focus. It came quietly, the way most irreversible decisions do, after the emotional noise has already settled. By then I had clarity about my value, about the system, about the limits of what could change without redefining my role entirely. What remained was choice. I listed my options, not in a dramatic way, but methodically. I could stay and push for recognition, ask for a title adjustment, a formal expansion of authority. That path required conversations I knew how to have. I could present evidence, make a case, be persuasive. But I also knew what that would cost. It would require me to convince comfortable people, not seeing me, that they should start. It would require me to translate my worth into language they valued: visibility, assertiveness, self-promotion. And even if I succeeded, I would still be operating inside a structure that had already shown me its default. I could stay and disengage emotionally, do my work, collect my paycheck, protect my energy. Many people choose this, and I understand why. It's survivable, it's safe. But safety, I realized, isn't the same as sustainability. The third option was the one I had avoided thinking about for a long time. Not because it was impossible, but because it was final. Leaving. Not impulsively, not dramatically, not as a reaction to a bad day, but as a conscious withdrawal from a system that no longer aligned with my values. That option came with uncertainty, financial recalibration, professional risk, the discomfort of explaining a decision that others might not understand. But it also came with something else: agency. I sat with that word for a long time. Agency isn't about control over outcomes, it's about ownership over decisions, about choosing based on internal alignment rather than external validation. I thought about the person I had been when I started, how willing I had been to prove myself through work alone, how much I had trusted that respect would follow effort. And I thought about the person I was becoming: more observant, more precise, less willing to accept ambiguity where clarity was required. Staying would require me to compromise that evolution, to re enter a role I had already outgrown. Leaving would require me to trust it. I didn't talk to anyone about this at first, not because I was hiding, but because I needed the decision to be clean, unpolluted by reassurance or doubt. I wanted to know that whatever I chose, it would be mine. The final clarity came during a meeting I barely remember the details of now. Another planning session, another optimistic timeline, another moment where responsibility was distributed without authority. As I listened, I realized I wasn't angry. I was detached, and detachment is not the beginning of repair. It's the end of the negotiation. That was the moment I knew, not with drama, with certainty. I chose the option that couldn't be undone, not because it was bold, but because it was honest. Leaving wasn't a threat, it wasn't leverage, it wasn't a message, it was a boundary. Once I named that, everything else became procedural, practical, calm. I began planning, not the exit itself, but the way I would leave, with professionalism, with clarity, without burning anything down. Because this decision wasn't about teaching anyone a lesson. It was about refusing to participate in my own diminishing. And that, I knew, was not something I could ever reverse. Once the decision was made, everything slowed down. Not externally, work continued at its usual pace. But internally, there was a steadiness I hadn't felt in a long time. The anxious mental rehearsals stopped. The quiet bargaining ended. I wasn't weighing possibilities anymore. I was executing a plan. And I did it the same way I had done everything else. Silently, carefully, cleanly. I didn't announce dissatisfaction. I didn't signal departure. I didn't change my tone or my standards. I continued showing up on time, delivering what I was responsible for, and documenting what mattered. But now every action has intention. I reviewed my contract in detail, not with resentment, but with precision. Notice periods, obligations, language around handover. I made sure I understood not just what was required of me, but what wasn't. I consulted a financial advisor, not to make dramatic moves, but to remove uncertainty. I adjusted timelines, built buffers, ensured that leaving would not feel like stepping off a cliff, but like stepping onto another surface. I updated my resume quietly, framing my work accurately for the first time. Not inflated, not modest, just true. I realized how much I had minimized my impact even to myself. Conversations began happening outside the building: coffee meetings, neutral check-ins, exploratory discussions. I didn't complain. I didn't position myself as a victim. I spoke about my work, my standards, and what I was looking to grow into. People listened. That alone told me I was making the right choice. At the office, nothing looked different. Mark still stopped by with questions. Meetings still followed familiar patterns. My calendar remained full. What changed was what I no longer offered. I didn't stay late to compensate for poor planning. I didn't rescue conversations that lacked clarity. I didn't absorb emotional labor that wasn't acknowledged or shared. And because I didn't announce this shift, it took time for anyone to notice. That's the thing about systems built on invisible labor. They don't register its absence immediately. At first, there's just friction, minor confusion, a sense that things feel heavier than they should. I watched it unfold without satisfaction or guilt. I wasn't sabotaging anything. I was simply no longer subsidizing dysfunction with my silence. There was a moment, a few weeks in, when Mark asked me casually, "Everything okay? You've seemed different." I met his eyes and said, "Honestly, I'm just being more intentional about my scope." He nodded slowly, as if filing that away without fully understanding it. "Well," he said, "let me know if you need anything." I almost smiled, because for years I had been the one ensuring no one else needed anything. Now I let that sentence stand as it was. Behind the scenes, I prepared my exit with respect. I organized documentation so that whoever followed wouldn't be lost. I outlined processes clearly. I ensured continuity where possible. Not because I owed it to them, but because it aligned with who I am. Moving in silence isn't about secrecy. It's about refusing to perform your intentions before they're ready to stand on their own. I didn't want a reaction. I didn't want promises or panic. I didn't want to be persuaded to stay by a version of recognition that arrived too late. I wanted the decision to speak for itself. By the time everything was in place, I felt no rush, no adrenaline, just readiness. What no one understood yet was that the most significant change had already happened. I wasn't waiting to be valued. I was acting as someone who already valued herself. And when that happens, the rest is just timing. The first consequences were quiet enough to be mistaken for a coincidence. A client asked for clarification on a report that had always been accepted without question. A deadline slipped. Not drastically, just enough to require explanation. A meeting ended with more questions than answers, the kind that linger and slow momentum. None of it was catastrophic. That's important. Nothing broke. No alarms sounded. But the ease was gone. I noticed it in the way conversations changed, in the pauses that stretched a little longer than before, in the follow-up emails that multiplied where one used to suffice, in the subtle tightening of voices when things didn't resolve themselves as smoothly. People began compensating. Mark became more involved in operational details, asking questions he hadn't asked in years. Leadership requested additional check-ins. Processes that had flowed quietly now required oversight. No one connected this to me, and that strangely was the point. When your work has been invisible, its absence doesn't announce itself. It diffuses. It shows up as friction, not as loss. I watched this unfold without commentary. I answered questions when they were directed to me. I provided information when it was requested. But I didn't anticipate needs that hadn't been articulated. I didn't smooth over misalignments before they surfaced. The system was feeling its own weight. One afternoon, I overheard Mark on a call, his voice sharper than usual. "We'll need to realign expectations," he said. "Yes, I know, we're adjusting." Adjusting. That word had once belonged to me. Now it belonged to him. There was a subtle shift in how people interacted with me as well. A few colleagues checked in more often, asking if I had insight or context. Their tone wasn't demanding, it was tentative, as if they were realizing that access wasn't guaranteed. I remained professional, calm, clear, but I didn't rush. The most telling change came during a leadership meeting I was invited to for the first time in months. The conversation revolved around a project that had lost momentum. Questions were asked, assumptions were challenged. There was a visible effort to regain control. Mark spoke confidently, but there was an edge to it, a sense that he was holding too many threads at once. At one point, someone asked, "Do we have documentation on how this process evolved?" There was a pause. Mark glanced at me, just for a moment, then said, "We're consolidating that now." I said nothing, not out of spite, out of clarity. I had documented everything, thoroughly, but it wasn't my responsibility to volunteer information that hadn't been requested, especially in a room that had rarely included me before. After the meeting, Mark approached me. "If you have anything that could help," he said carefully, "it would be good to share it." I met his gaze. "Of course, just let me know what you're looking for." The balance had shifted, not dramatically, not visibly, but the assumption that my support was automatic was no longer intact. I felt no satisfaction in this, no sense of victory. What I felt was confirmation that my understanding of the system had been accurate, that my contributions had been structural, not incidental, and that staying had required me to keep masking that truth. The consequences weren't punishment, they were exposed. Exposure of how much had rested on something that had never been named, acknowledged, or protected. As the days passed, the atmosphere grew heavier, not tense, but alert, as if everyone was suddenly aware that things required more effort than they used to. No one blamed me, but no one could ignore the difference either. And I knew then that when the next step came, when I finally spoke, it wouldn't feel like a shock to the system. It would feel like the explanation everyone had been circling without quite reaching. By the time concern turned into urgency, the window for repair had already closed. The signs were there first, small human signals. Mark grew more formal in his interactions with me, less casual, more measured. His question shifted from can you to would you be able to. Language changes when certainty dissolves. Leadership began asking for summaries, documentation, and clarification on decisions that had once moved unquestioned. Meetings multiplied, follow-ups stacked. The system was trying to correct itself. Too late. One afternoon, Mark asked me to step into a conference room. Not urgently, not aggressively, just deliberately. He closed the door and sat across from me, hands folded on the table. I've noticed you've pulled back lately, he said. You're still doing good work, but things feel different. I nodded. They are. He hesitated. If there's something you need, support, recognition, clearer scope, we can talk about it. There it was. Not an apology, not an acknowledgement of what had happened. An offer, framed in the present tense, as if the past were irrelevant. I studied his face as he spoke. He looked sincere, slightly unsettled. He was trying to fix a problem he could finally feel, even if he couldn't yet name it. And that's when I realized something important. Timing is part of respect. Recognition offered only when loss becomes visible isn't recognition, it's a negotiation. I didn't say any of that, I replied calmly. I appreciate you asking. He leaned forward slightly, encouraged. We value you here, he said. We'd like to make sure you feel that. I believed him. In his own way, he meant it. But valuing someone after they've already done the work of leaving doesn't change the fact that the conditions that led them there were tolerated for too long. What he was offering now wasn't alignment. It was retention. And those are not the same. I told him I needed time to think. He agreed quickly, perhaps relieved to have not lost control of the moment. But the truth was, the thinking had already been done. Over the next few days, I noticed a shift in tone from others as well. A little more courtesy, a little more inclusion. Invitations to conversations I hadn't been part of before. It would have been tempting to see this as progress, but progress that depends on withdrawal isn't sustainable. It teaches the wrong lesson, that respect is conditional on leverage, not inherent to contribution. I also noticed something else. None of these changes addressed the underlying issue. No one said, we overlooked you. No one said, we normalized your silence. No one said, we built systems that relied on you without protecting you. They were trying to adjust behavior without examining belief, and belief is what shapes culture. I didn't resent them for this. Most people don't know what they're doing until it stops working. But I also didn't owe them another cycle of patience. The door hadn't slammed shut. It had closed slowly, quietly, long before anyone noticed. By the time the conversation shifted from what's wrong to how do we fix it, the answer had already changed. You can't repair a dynamic once one person has fully stepped out of it internally. You can only renegotiate terms, and I no longer wanted to negotiate my worth. This wasn't about punishment or pride. It was about self-trust. I had learned to recognize the difference between being valued and being needed, between being included and being used. And once you see that clearly, going back feels like erasing your own progress. They weren't wrong for trying to fix it. They were just too late. The confrontation, when it finally happened, didn't feel like a confrontation at all. There was no raised voice, no accusations, no dramatic pause meant to land a final blow. It was quiet, almost understated, which somehow made it more definitive. I asked Mark for a meeting. Not urgently, not emotionally, just a calendar request with a neutral subject line. He accepted within minutes. When I walked into his office, he stood up, smiled politely, and gestured for me to sit. The door closed softly behind me. The room felt smaller than usual, or maybe I was just more aware of its limits. I didn't ease into it. I've decided to resign, I said, placing a single-page letter on the desk between us. He blinked, once, then again. I didn't realize it was that serious, he said carefully. It's not about seriousness, I replied. It's about alignment. He picked up the letter but didn't open it yet. We were talking, he said, about adjusting things, making sure you're recognized. I nodded. I know. There was a pause, not tense, processing. I wish you'd said something earlier, he said. I met his eyes. I did, just not loudly. That was the closest I came to confrontation. I didn't list grievances. I didn't recount meetings or moments. I didn't argue my case like a closing statement. I had already lived it. Repeating it wouldn't change anything. Instead, I said, I stayed longer than I should have because I believed consistency would be enough. It wasn't, and I don't want to become someone who needs to fight to be seen. He leaned back, exhaling slowly. We didn't see it that way. I know, I said. That's part of the problem. The silence that followed wasn't defensive. It was reflective. For the first time, we were speaking from different timelines. He was still in the moment. I had already moved past it. What would make you stay? He asked. It wasn't manipulative. It was practical. The kind of question leaders are trained to ask. I considered it, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted to answer honestly. Nothing, I said gently. Not because nothing could be offered, but because I don't want to rebuild my sense of worth in the same place it eroded. That landed, not as an insult, as a boundary. He nodded slowly. I'm sorry, he said, not performatively, just plainly. I believe you, I replied, and I did. Apologies don't lose their value just because they come late. They just lose their power to change outcomes. We talked logistics after that, notice period, transition, documentation. The conversation stayed professional, almost calm to the point of formality. But beneath it, something had shifted. He wasn't speaking to a subordinate anymore. He was speaking to someone who had already left, internally, decisively, without resentment. When the meeting ended, he stood and thanked me for my work. The words sounded heavier now, as if he finally understood their weight. I walked out of his office without relief or bitterness, just certainty. Confrontation without heat doesn't aim to win. It aims to conclude. And that conversation wasn't about closure for him. It was about confirmation for me. Leaving didn't feel like an escape. It felt like an arrival. Not in the sense of having reached a final destination, but in the sense of having returned to myself, without distortion, without apology. In the weeks after my resignation, I noticed how my body responded to the absence of that environment. My shoulders relaxed, my thoughts slowed, the constant low-level vigilance, the awareness of how much space I was allowed to take, quieted. I hadn't realized how much of my energy had been spent on calibration. Who I am now isn't dramatically different from who I was then. I'm still observant, still calm, still deliberating, but those traits no longer function as camouflage. They're choices. I work differently now, in spaces where clarity is welcomed, not quietly extracted, where contribution and authority are aligned, where silence isn't assumed to mean agreement and composure isn't mistaken for compliance. More importantly, I relate to myself differently. I don't explain my boundaries in advance. I don't soften them to be palatable. I state them once, clearly, and let others decide how to respond. That doesn't make me rigid. It makes me honest. I've learned that respect isn't something you negotiate after it's been lost. It's something you maintain by noticing when the cost of staying quiet outweighs the benefit of staying comfortable. I no longer measure my worth by how smoothly things run around me. I measure it by how aligned I feel within myself. And alignment changes how you move through the world. I'm less available, but more present, less accommodating, but more generous when it matters. I choose environments where my strengths don't need to be hidden to be useful. Sometimes people ask if I regret not speaking up sooner. I don't, because the version of me who stayed quiet wasn't weak. She was learning. She was gathering information, even when she didn't know it yet. She was building the discernment that allows me to walk away now without bitterness. Growth isn't about rewriting the past. It's about understanding it without self-contempt. What I carry forward from that experience isn't resentment toward Mark or the company. It's discernment. The ability to recognize when systems reward silence at the expense of dignity, and the confidence to leave those systems without needing them to admit fault. I don't tell this story to warn people to quit. Not every uncomfortable environment requires departure. Sometimes staying and changing things is the right choice. But staying should be a choice, not a habit reinforced by hope. Who I am now is someone who trusts her internal signals, who understands that quiet does not mean small, and that dominance doesn't require volume. It requires boundaries, and boundaries, once established, change everything. There's a line I keep returning to when I think about that chapter of my life. Respect lost is hard to earn back, not because people are cruel or unwilling, but because once a dynamic is set, it becomes invisible to those who benefit from it. And invisibility is powerful. It convinces everyone involved that nothing is wrong until someone stops participating. What this experience taught me isn't that silence is bad. Silence can be wise, strategic, protective. But silence without boundaries becomes a language others will speak for you. I don't believe my boss intended to humiliate me. Even that meeting, the one people always ask about, wasn't fueled by malice, it was fueled by assumption. The assumption that I would absorb the moment, smooth it over, and move on as I always had. And that's the quiet danger. When your strength becomes predictable, people stop treating it as strength. They treat it as a resource. The meeting didn't change me. It revealed what had already been decided by me internally long before anyone else noticed. The resignation letter wasn't a weapon, it was a consequence. Not for him, for me. It was the moment I chose to stop proving my value to people who benefited from not fully seeing it. If there's a moral here, it's not leave when you're disrespected. It's more subtle than that. It's this: pay attention to what your silence is buying you and what it's costing you. If silence gives you safety, clarity, time to prepare, use it. If silence requires you to shrink, self erase, or accept misalignment, question it. And if respect only appears when you're halfway out the door, ask yourself whether it's respect or fear of loss. I didn't leave angry, I didn't leave loudly, I left intact. That matters, because the goal isn't to win against others. The goal is to stop losing yourself. If you've ever been described as reliable, easy, or low maintenance, not as praise, but as expectation, if you've ever watched your ideas resurface in someone else's voice, if you've ever felt the weight of being essential but unseen, you're not imagining it, and you're not wrong for noticing. I'll leave you with this question, and I genuinely want to hear your answer in the comments. Have you ever stayed quiet to keep the peace, only to realize later that the peace came at your expense? If so, what did you do next?